They say that water has a memory, that it carries the echoes of everything it has ever touched. If that is true, then the waters of the lower Dnipro River are heavy with the ghosts of a summer night in 1941. It was a time when the world seemed to be coming apart at the seams, when ideologies clashed with the ferocity of titans, and when the absolute, terrifying scale of total war was fully revealed to the people of Ukraine. Imagine standing on the banks of a river so wide, it feels like an inland sea. It is a humid August evening, the air thick with the smell of dry grass and the distant, grinding rumble of an approaching mechanized army. You are a citizen of Zaporizhzhia, looking up at the horizon, waiting for a liberation that will never come, or fearing an occupation that promises only darkness. But what you don't know, what no one on the ground knows, is that the greatest threat isn't the steel tanks rolling toward the city, nor the swastikas flying in the distance. The greatest threat is looming directly above you, a man-made mountain of concrete and steel holding back a literal ocean. It is a weapon that is about to be turned against its own people, in a catastrophe so absolute that for decades, history would try its best to bury it under the silt of the riverbed. This is the story of the Dnipro Dam, the pride of the Soviet Union, and the night it was shattered by its own creators. To understand the sheer scale of what happened, you have to understand what the Dnipro Dam actually was. In the 1920s and 30s, the Soviet Union was obsessed with the idea of the future. They wanted to drag a largely agrarian society into the modern industrial age, and they needed a symbol of that ambition. They found it in the Dnipro River. They called the project Dnipro GES, a massive hydroelectric station that would tame the rapids and power the industrial heartland of Ukraine. It was a marvel of engineering, a gargantuan wall of concrete that spanned the river, standing taller than a 10-story building. It was more than just electricity. It was a cathedral of socialist progress. People flocked to see it. It appeared on propaganda posters, in films, and in the dreams of Soviet architects. It was the jewel of the nation's crown. But as the 1940s dawned, the world grew darker. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that fragile non-aggression agreement between Stalin and Hitler, shattered under the weight of Nazi ambitions. In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. The Wehrmacht surged across the border with a speed and ferocity that the Soviet leadership had dangerously underestimated. By mid-August, the situation on the front lines was catastrophic. The Germans were advancing through the Ukrainian steppe, and the Soviet High Command was gripped by a singular, cold-blooded doctrine: the scorched earth policy. Stalin's orders were absolute. If the Red Army could not hold a territory, then nothing of value could be left for the invaders. No factories, no grain, no fuel, and certainly no infrastructure that could aid the enemy. This policy turned every city into a potential sacrifice. As the German spearheads closed in on Zaporizhzhia, the fate of the Dnipro Dam was sealed. It wasn't a tactical debate. It was a death sentence. The authorities knew that if the Germans captured the dam, they would possess the power to run the factories, to support their occupation, and to control the river transport. And so, in the frantic, paranoid, and terrifying atmosphere of the Soviet retreat, the decision was made. The dam would not be surrendered. It would be destroyed. The preparation for the demolition was conducted in utter secrecy. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the entire event. The local population, the thousands of workers who had built the dam, the families living in the low-lying districts downstream, and even the local Soviet officials were kept entirely in the dark. The operation was handled by the NKVD, the feared secret police, and a handful of military engineers who were tasked with planting the explosives. Imagine the scene: military trucks arriving in the dead of night, crates of high-grade explosives being ferried into the galleries and inspection tunnels of the dam. The engineers knew what they were doing. They weren't just trying to damage the dam, they were trying to punch a hole in the sky. They calculated the weight, the placement, the amount of ammonium nitrate required to create a breach that would release the colossal weight of the reservoir. They worked with the grim efficiency of executioners. August 18th, 1941, arrived with a sweltering, oppressive heat. The German vanguard was less than a few miles away. The city of Zaporizhzhia was a hive of frantic activity. Soldiers were retreating, civilians were trying to gather their belongings, and the air was thick with the dust of moving vehicles and the smoke of burning buildings. The tension was palpable. It was the kind of atmospheric pressure that precedes a great storm. People were flooding toward the river, trying to cross the dam, which served as a crucial bridge for those attempting to flee the encroaching German lines. It was a bottleneck, a stream of humanity. Tanks, trucks, horse-drawn carts, and thousands of refugees on foot, all pressing forward in the hope of reaching safety on the other bank. They looked up at the massive concrete structure, feeling a sense of false security. They believed they were shielded by the strength of the dam. They had no idea that they were standing on a powder keg. At approximately 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the engineers struck the matches. There was no siren to warn the population. There were no evacuation orders for the low-lying settlements below the dam. There was only the sudden, earth-shattering roar. It wasn't just a sound. It was a physical blow, a concussive force that knocked people off their feet for miles around. Witnesses would later describe it as the end of the world. A massive section of the concrete wall, the pride of the Soviet industrial project, simply disintegrated. But it wasn't the explosion itself that did the most damage. It was what followed. A wall of water, a tsunami of unprecedented scale, surged through the breach. The Dnipro reservoir was massive, and the sudden release of all that pressure created a torrent that roared down the river valley like the wrath of an angry god. The tragedy of that moment is hard to fully comprehend. The wave did not just sweep away the structures below the dam, it decimated the living. Thousands of Soviet soldiers, still in the process of retreating across the bridges and the lower banks, were caught in the surge. Refugees, women, children, the elderly, anyone who was in the path of the river, were simply washed away. The accounts of the survivors are harrowing. They speak of a sudden, deafening rush of water that turned the river into a churning, chaotic graveyard. The bridge, crowded with retreating troops and fleeing civilians, was hit by the initial wall of water and debris. It collapsed, taking everyone on it into the dark, swirling depths of the Dnipro. The chaos was absolute. One moment there was the struggle to escape the Nazis, and the next, there was the struggle to survive the very landscape itself. The German forces, arriving on the scene shortly after, were stunned. They had expected to capture a valuable prize, a source of power and logistical support. Instead, they found a river that had been turned into an impassable swamp, a destroyed monument, and a humanitarian disaster of epic proportions. The German officers were reportedly shocked by the sheer callousness of the destruction. They had seen the brutality of the Blitzkrieg, but this was different. This was the Soviet Union destroying its own people and its own greatest achievements to deny the enemy a foothold. The water flooded the lower districts of the city, destroying villages, flooding crops, and turning the surrounding plains into a morass of mud and wreckage. The loss of life remains a subject of debate among historians, as the Soviet archives were heavily curated and censored regarding the incident. Some estimates place the death toll in the thousands, perhaps even higher, as the civilian casualties were never officially tallied. It was a secret that Stalin and the Soviet leadership wanted to keep buried. As the dust settled and the waters began to slowly recede, the reality of the situation set in. The German occupation of Zaporizhzhia would proceed, but the dam, the very thing they had wanted, was effectively useless. The scorched earth policy had succeeded in its tactical goal, but at a cost that is difficult to justify even by the cold logic of war. The incident became a haunting example of the total war mentality, where human life is relegated to a statistic in the ledger of national defense. For the survivors, the trauma was permanent. They had lost their homes, their city, and their loved ones, not just to the invaders, but to the desperate, terrifying measures of their own government. For decades, the story of the Dnipro Dam explosion was whispered, but rarely spoken. It was an uncomfortable truth, a stain on the record of the Great Patriotic War. The Soviet narrative focused on the heroism of the Red Army and the resilience of the people, not on the times when the state turned against its own. It wasn't until the later years of the Soviet Union, and particularly after its collapse, that researchers began to piece together the events of that August day. They combed through military logs, gathered oral histories from the few surviving witnesses, and began to map out the reality of what occurred. What emerged was a picture of institutional ruthlessness. The destruction of the dam was not a rogue action. It was a systematic, calculated, and terrifyingly efficient execution of a top-down order. Today, the Dnipro Dam stands once again, rebuilt and powerful. It serves as a reminder of resilience, a monument to the ability of a city to recover and rebuild from the ashes of destruction. But if you stand there today, if you look out over the vast expanse of the reservoir and listen to the hum of the turbines, it is hard not to think of the silence that followed the roar in 1941. You can't help but think about the people on the bridge, the soldiers, the families, the people who were simply trying to survive a war that they didn't start and didn't want. The dam represents the duality of progress and destruction, the way that the tools we build to improve our lives can, in the blink of an eye, become the instruments of our undoing. The event forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of survival and the ethics of war. What does a nation owe its citizens when the survival of the state is at stake? Is it acceptable to sacrifice thousands of lives to deny an enemy a temporary advantage? These are not questions with easy answers. They are the questions that define the darkest chapters of human history. The Dnipro Dam explosion stands as a testament to the fact that, in the calculus of war, the human element is often the first thing to be discarded. It is a cautionary tale, a stark reminder that the machinery of state, when driven by fear and the logic of total destruction, can become a force of nature as uncontrollable and devastating as the river itself. As we look back on those dark days of 1941, it is essential that we don't just see the military strategies or the geopolitical shifts. We must see the people. We must remember the faces of those who were on the bridge, the confusion in their eyes, the terror of that sudden, roaring water. We must recognize that every historical event, no matter how grand in scale, is composed of thousands of individual stories, individual lives, and individual tragedies. The destruction of the Dnipro Dam wasn't just a military operation. It was a profound, life-altering moment for an entire community. It left scars that would take generations to heal, both on the landscape and in the collective memory of the people. In the end, history is not just about what happened. It is about how we remember it. By telling the story of the Dnipro Dam, we are acknowledging the complexity of the past, the brutal reality of total war, and the resilience of those who endure. We are ensuring that the ghosts of that August night are not forgotten, that their voices are heard amidst the roar of the river. The dam remains a symbol, yes, but its meaning has changed. It is no longer just a monument to socialist industry. It is a memorial to the cost of survival, a reminder of the fragility of peace, and a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of absolute, overwhelming destruction. When you look at the Dnipro today, you are looking at more than just water and concrete. You are looking at a history that refuses to be silenced, a river that carries the memory of a tragedy that the world must never stop trying to understand. As the sun sets over the Dnipro, the water catches the fading light, turning into a sheet of liquid gold. It is beautiful, serene, and deceptively calm. It is hard to reconcile this peaceful scene with the violence that once tore through this place. Yet, that is the nature of history. It overlays the present with the shadows of the past, requiring us to look deeper, to listen closer, to acknowledge the stories that are hidden just beneath the surface. The story of the Dnipro Dam is a profound reminder that we are all, in a way, living on the banks of a river that is constantly moving, constantly changing, and constantly carrying the weight of everything that has come before. And in that realization, perhaps, there is a lesson about the necessity of memory, the importance of empathy, and the enduring power of truth to cut through even the deepest, most carefully constructed silence. The waters of the Dnipro will continue to flow, but they will never truly forget. And neither should we. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the shadows of World War II, make sure to hit that subscribe button for The Lost Dispatch. We travel through the forgotten files of history to bring you the stories that were never meant to be told. What historical mystery should we decode next? Let us know in the comments.